Welcome to the tip of the spear. So great. Everybody can hear me? So great to see you all here in San Diego. My name is Michael Levine. I'm Senior Vice President, Head of Learning and Impact at Noggin, which is Nickelodeon's early learning service, part of Paramount, if you didn't get the memo. Viacom CBS is now Paramount. And I'm so delighted to be part of this early learning track that Sesame Workshop, our colleagues at Sesame Workshop and I have been working on over the last few months. And we have a magnificent group of folks here to talk about a range of different issues that relate to early learning, COVID, innovation, and no pressure, the future of early childhood education. So in the next 39 minutes, we are going to tackle these issues. There's about 4 or 5 other sessions that are aligned here on the program, so check them out. The schedule's outside and on your app. So let's see who's here. Educators, technologists, people who are really interested in tech, / researchers, parents? Okay. Who am I missing? Investors? Some investors? Excellent. So we know a little bit more about our audience. Rappers, Jen Cotler. Check out tomorrow night's main show. Run DMC, Daryl McDaniels is going to give a great presentation with Alejandro. So I just want to get started. In this session, we're going to reflect on the extraordinary period we have all experienced to look ahead at the future. How many of you are here at a conference, a professional conference for the first time since COVID? How does it feel? It's weird, right? It's good though. There's a lot of energy, here. People are really, jazzed to share their thoughts and their ideas. So I'm just really delighted. So I'm going to get started with each of our panelists. We're going to give a little bit of an opening, statement to express their leadership work and to answer a few different questions. So with me, and no introductions necessary because we've been instructed not to do them, is Michelle Kang. Everyone should give her a round of applause because she's the new Executive Director / CEO of the National Association for the Education of Young Children. This is her first public appearance since, I think, getting that role, but she's not officially on board, so not until May.
May 2nd.
And to her left is Alejandro. Does everybody know Alejandro? You'll get to know him very well. He's the founder of Springboard Collaborative.
Yep.
And to Alejandro's left is Alison, parentheses, Ali Bryant, who also has a very new job, 2 months? Mm-hmm. About 2 months. Heading up data, research, something with innovation in the title too, at Sesame Workshop. So I'm going to start with Alejandro, who has been doing a lot of pioneering work in early literacy. Say a little bit about why you started Springboard Collaborative and a little bit about what's happening at Springboard right now over the last couple of years, Alejandro.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, fellow panelists, for engaging in conversation. Family engagement is the beating heart of the work that I do, so I always start the story with my family. I'm half Chilean, half Puerto Rican. My dad, in Chile in the 1970s, he wrote a play in protest of the dictator Pinochet called Libertad, Libertad. As you might imagine, Pinochet was not a fan. My dad became a political prisoner, unfortunately, but he was luckier after a few years of torture than many of his friends to make it out alive. And even luckier to meet my mom. My mom is the youngest of 12 siblings in Puerto Rico. I know. She's the first in her family to go to college on a graduate school scholarship. Her and my dad met. Anyhow, my parents, like so many immigrants, came to the U.S. so that my sister and I could have better educational opportunities. But unfortunately, when they got here, they realized that schools serving poor families like ours tend not to live up to America's promise. So we tried a new strategy. We'd rent the tiniest home in an overwhelmingly affluent and white community with a highly rated public school. That didn't work either. My sister and I succeeded in spite of the school, not because of it. My teachers only ever treated my parents as pushy immigrants that didn't belong in the school system, frankly, the same way that my classmates treated me. And even all the way through high school, my guidance counselor tried to talk me out of applying to Harvard to, quote, avoid the disappointment of rejection. And then later that fall, she seemed pretty disappointed to see my acceptance letter. So after graduating, I joined Teach for America, became my best attempt at a first grade teacher in North Philly, teaching in a Puerto Rican neighborhood. I could see myself in my kids, I could see my parents in their parents, and the connection was deeper than even just our shared language and culture and experience of childhood poverty. It was the look. My students' parents gazed at their kids with the same eyes, the same unconditional optimism, the same unconditional love, the same unbridled support with which my parents gazed at me, the same eyes with which my wife and I gazed at our 9-month-old daughter. I quickly became frustrated, though, that my school, and more broadly our system, was approaching black and brown parents like mine as liabilities rather than as assets. And the education sector tends to think of a child's home life as a risk to be mitigated rather than as a resource to be cultivated. And I knew we were missing a massive opportunity. The research is clear that parental involvement in their children's learning is a more powerful predictor of academic success than any other variable, including race, including socioeconomic status. In other words, families, not schools, are the biggest determinants of kids' academic success. And yet our education system wasn't doing a whole lot about it, still isn't doing a whole lot about it, fixating instead on the 13% of kids' waking hours that they spend in the classroom. So long story short, I founded Springboard Collaborative a decade ago now to close the literacy gap by closing the gap between home and school. And we do that work by coaching parents and teachers to team up and help kids learn to read by 4th grade. As you can imagine, that work is accelerated during the pandemic. There's been an overdue awakening about the essential role that parents play in their children's learning at home. And so we've been growing quickly. As just a recent example, we just won a $16 million contract with LAUSD to scale up our work there.
Congratulations. That's
Thanks.
great.
Excited about it.
I mean, and condolences. It is LAUSD, but please continue.
Oh, no, that's it. I've been rambling for a little while now.
Really, really great. Michelle, you're up next. Congrats again on the new post. And, obviously the last 2 years have been remarkably difficult for the early childhood profession, from the failure of childcare centers, the enormous stress on, caregivers, themselves. But, also, I would say, a moment of reckoning in terms of the kind of systemic reforms that might be, necessary moving forward. Some folks comment on the need to use any kind of chaos as an opportunity. So the patchwork system is still under attack in early childhood. What have you been thinking about in your strategic role at NEYC, and what are you looking forward to now in your new role as the head of an organization that I've learned everything that I needed to learn about developmentally appropriate practice from?
Thank you so much. And I have to say what a joy it is to be here to talk about early childhood. You've set it up beautifully to talk about how we are at a moment of reckoning for a field that was already so fragile that the foundation was shaky and the pandemic literally shattered it. So I am deeply grateful to be here on behalf of NACY's 60,000 members and early childhood educators across the country. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this week is actually the Week of the Young Child, where we celebrate the joy of what early childhood is and what we all want it to be for young children. What we want it to be for young children, for educators, for parents, for families, for schools. So I hope you'll join me in continuing to lift up the joy of early childhood education as we go through this week. Today is Tasty Tuesday. We have each day is a theme. Yesterday was Music Monday, and it was terrific to be able to see Daryl McDaniels of Run DMC to think about what music brings to all of our young children. But to go back to this field and to the pandemic, it is early on in the pandemic, when suddenly childcare programs from across the country saw 70% of their enrollment disappear overnight, that they were suddenly faced with this idea of what they could do in terms of, excuse me, is that better? What they needed to do in order to either see their programs fade away or to make some tough decisions to be able to keep doing what many of them loved. The field has been largely undervalued in the way that we support early educators and our programs. Early educators, in many places, the average wage is $12 an hour. Many of them qualify for federal assistance, and many programs need outside support in order to be able to serve their families. Parents can't pay more, teachers can't pay less, and above all, equity becomes laid bare in early childhood because of the fact that so many teachers are in a profession that they would love to be able to continue to do, and many of them are forced away from it. So the pandemic forced this reckoning of needing support, and thankfully, due to a $50 billion investment from the federal government, programs that would have closed remained open, and we've been able to put a Band-Aid on many programs that would have otherwise closed. At the same time, I think that you have seen the extraordinary resilience of the field and new ways that early educators have seen opportunities to be able to strengthen those connections, like Alejandro talked about, with parents, with each other, with their community, with policymakers, to better understand how we can continue to lift up and support young children. So, I think about how technology was quickly seen as the way that we're going to be doing schooling. And I don't know about you, but I'm a working parent, and seeing how many of you had to suddenly figure out your jobs and then also look after the schooling of your children. Yeah, that wasn't. I don't think that was an experiment that any of us asked for. But I think for early education, one of the things that we saw is that it actually emphasized for us the one core thing that is about developmentally appropriate practice, which is that high-quality early learning is about adult and child interactions, and that has remained core to what we know as we evolve to what's next, and is critical as we think ahead.
Great. And batting cleanup is Dr. Alison Bryant. Allie has a tremendous, background in kids media research, production, evaluation, social impact from cradle to cane. Her most recent post was at AARP. So you really are spanning the ASU from, whatever it is, cradle to gray or whatever they say here at ASU, and in a new post too. So you're probably still getting a sense of the landscape at the children's, media, most iconic, organization, Sesame. What are you thinking about as you enter this new role, knowing that things may or may not have permanently shifted for children and families post-pandemic?
Yeah, so, I think there's a few things that I've been really focused on. I should say I'm also a parent of this age group and have currently a 4 and a 7-year-old. So imagine a 2 and a 5-year-old when the pandemic started. So I've literally lived this as a parent on that side. I think the three things, and I have a laundry list, so I'm sure we all have a laundry list of things that have changed, and we think, we're interested to see if they stay the same. But the ones that I feel like are top for me that we need to focus on, one is equity. And I think equity beyond the way we often talk about it, certainly digital equity, which Michelle brought up, I think that's going to be a super critical piece. We saw what happened with digital inequity. This is across all ages, but that was a real issue. But also equity in things like learning styles or learning needs. And what does that look like? So I have, my 7-year-old who was just diagnosed with ADHD and ODD, we were looking at putting him into public kindergarten. We were super excited. And I just looked and went, this child is not going to sit on Zoom. Right? Now, we happen to have the resources, and we had to pay for private kindergarten. We could do that. But I looked out, and I said, oh, my God, how many of other kids certainly don't have, parents don't have the resources to do that. And so I think that piece is really important, that piece of equity. I think another piece, and both Alejandro and Michelle sort of mentioned this, is really better understanding and empowering the family learning ecosystem. Yes, parents, absolutely, but other caregivers. I'm going to put on my AARP hat for a second and say grandparents. We saw grandparents stepping in and playing a role during the pandemic that we hadn't seen them necessarily do, certainly in the learning context in a while, right? And so I think really thinking about how do we empower them, what are they going through, how do we address work-life balance, all those things are actually very important because we know those things trickle down to children. The stresses of the parents trickle down. And I think related to that, the issues of social emotional health, mental wellness, those are all things that we saw really reach crisis proportions. We know that, counselors in schools right now are just so overwhelmed. They literally don't know what to do. There aren't enough of them, and they're not getting necessarily the supports to do that. So how do we address what's happening, again, in home, in schools, and these added stressors? Because children, they see it, they feel it, And they have for 2 years, right? I think the key thing was this wasn't just a blip, right? We heard a lot about, well, children are very resilient. Yeah, not for 2 years, right? Parents are really resilient. Not for 2 years. This is still going on. So I think acknowledging that there is no more new normal and that we are going to have to address these things moving forward is going to be really critical for our success.
Terrific. Let me just follow up with you a little bit on that, Ali. Where do you think innovation, so you mentioned 3 major themes right there: equity, sort of how to respond to the family, sort of ecology, and in particular, you emphasize the interest that we all have in social and emotional learning, sort of emotional health at this point. I mean, technology and innovation can sort of be cross purposes with some of those different key themes that you just raised. Can you say a little bit about how Sesame and you are thinking about the role of educational media in tech?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will say that at Sesame we're thinking about all the things I just mentioned and how we can address them in the sort of more traditional informal learning context we've been, but also in more formal learning context. I think we're really trying to think again across the spheres that children and parents and caregivers are learning. I think if I look at areas, I mean, there's a lot, again, of areas of innovation. I think a couple that I think are really critical. One, I mentioned digital equity. I think this idea of digital literacy in young children is something we haven't really necessarily addressed. We don't want to end up in a situation again where suddenly, kids are given screens without having had them before. The irony, of course, is I was doing the same thing at AARP, and it was the same issue. You don't want to just give a consumer, an older adult, a young child, a screen and be like, go. Because what we know is that it actually exacerbates things like social isolation, right? Confusion, frustration, anxiety. So how do we prepare children in a way that's developmentally appropriate so we don't have that as an issue moving forward? So digital literacy and skilling, I think, is a huge piece. It's not just tech. It's really the education piece around that's going to be critical, right? And not being fearful, right? I think we're long past that, right? We've seen that with parents. Any fears they had of technology, gone, right? Put my kid in front of a screen, fine, I need some, I'm working from home, give me something, right? So we need to support that. I think another thing, and this isn't exactly what I mentioned, although I think it does come up when we start talking about things like emotional health and even looking at the family learning ecosystem, are really rethinking the way that we measure the impact of these things, right? Looking at things like, digital assessment, right? So a lot of things went digital, and if you look at it, so when kids go online and they're playing something, right? They're playing and they're watching YouTube, they're doing these things, they're in play mode, right? They're in lean forward, they're playing. And if you look at any of the assessments we have, they're like translations of offline boring assessment into a digital space. So what does that look like if we start to think about things that are more playful, better learning analytics on the back end, ways that we can actually be measuring the impact of things that we're putting out in the world in a way that is easy for teachers, but is really seamless for children. So I think we have a huge amount of work to do in that space, but I think that will actually be transformational so that we understand what this looks like for these kids when the next thing happens and suddenly they're either online or they're in a hybrid environment.
Great. Well, one more follow-up. Audience check. How many of you work globally? Most of you are domestic, but yeah, a good handful. So, I mean, Sesame is, in 140, I'm an alum of Sesame.
150.
150, some odd, countries. How are you thinking about the issues, through the global, lens of Sesame these days? And maybe you're not thinking about it yet in your new role.
Oh, yeah, we are. No, I mean, I think certainly anything I just said, earlier is very relevant in a global context. I think, again, issues of equity and access are critical, whether you're talking about, children who are displaced in humanitarian, settings, or you're talking about, kids in crisis in the U.S. So I think there's a lot of actual continuity in some of the critical issues that we have to address. Certainly context is going to matter. We're dealing with completely different political and policy arenas, in different countries around the world, so we have to keep that in mind. But I'd say in general, a lot of these things are actually relatively universal. And for me, looking at groups at this conference, that's a great thing, right? So I think there's opportunity for us to innovate to scale, not just innovate for the US, right? Yes, of course, you have to contextualize, but a lot of these critical needs in white spaces are actually relatively universal.
Great. Thanks so much, Ali. Michelle, let's get you back into the conversation because, as much as we can do innovation for scaling with, inventive technologies, we all know that the human relationship, the leadership of the caregiver is, central. I was trained by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and that's just, sort of part of my DNA. Say a little bit about this reckoning and what you see as sort of a charted course for the field in terms of what the profession needs most these days. And if you want to include, innovations in your answer, that's fine too.
Well, I think first and foremost is that all of us are recognizing and we come together as unified advocates for this field and the important work that they do, right? We know that the brain science says that the brain is developing more rapidly in those first 5 years than any other time in a human lifespan. So we all recognize them, we all make the choices and decisions in terms of how we are going to support the field. I think I want to jump off of something that Ali said, actually, which is to talk about the fact that technology entered our space. It was already there, but it entered the space in a very different way during the pandemic. And I think for educators, one of the questions that I think that they were suddenly quickly faced with is, okay, so how does technology become not, a disruptor, but is instead a tool for learning? And then how do we also provide educators with the right support so that they can effectively use technology in a positive way that still keeps the teacher, the adult-child interactions at the core of early learning. So I think there's enormous opportunity in terms of innovating, thinking about how do we, after we have all reckoned and realized that the profession needs to be appropriately compensated, supported, all of these things, that in addition to that, we say, all right, what are the supports that we can put in place for educators so that they can continue to be successful in whatever environment that they're in? And then recognizing context. One thing that is on my mind a lot is I think about there's many different environments out there for early learning. There are childcare deserts, but how do we address
toddler deserts?
Yes, those childcare deserts where there is no high-quality childcare, but also in those environments, those educators are not supported because they don't have the access to some of the same tools and supports. So how do we also, from an equity standpoint, look at the fact that children are learning and families are learning in all different kinds of environments, that educators also need support. Some of them don't have strong access to digital tools. And so how do we think about the ecosystem of innovating in a place where we can continue to provide educators with support so that they can continue to do the wonderful things with children that we want them to be able to do?
And if there was one priority, sort of you're beginning to think about in terms of your leadership at NYC for the profession for the next 5 years, like, is it financing? Is it new way of thinking about credentialing? Like, what would you put your top priority on?
Only one.
We only have a few minutes.
Right. Well, so I think that NACE is in a unique place to be able to center the stories of what the educator experience is and what that means in terms of the profession. And so when I think about looking ahead into NACE and thinking about creating the culture of belonging for the early childhood community, but then coalescing all these supports, public support, private support, understanding that early childhood is so critical, that there are supports and ways to innovate and provide exciting ways to continue to have offerings for young children. But first and foremost is recognizing that it is a profession, that the profession is supported, that it is recognized, and that we coalesce all of these wonderful people who are here around finding their own way to support how young children can learn, how they can access that learning, how our educators can be supported, and how we as a country have a reckoning and say that we are going to invest in this because of the return on investment, but also how necessary it is even for our economy. How many people even in our own worlds we know are having childcare challenges and have left roles because they haven't been able to have access to the high quality supports that children need.
No, terrific. Thank you. Alejandro, let's get you back in here too. I'm thinking about the concreteness of literacy and sort of, you said that, congratulations again on the LAUSD. Sorry about that side comment about working there. I've tried to create schools in LAUSD. It's complicated. Say a little bit about what you have been observing and what you think we can expect in terms of this national early literacy, crisis. I mean, the numbers are just still so daunting in terms of the gaps in early literacy, skills and knowledge. What are you expecting to be able to, document with the innovations that you'll be doing in districts like LAUSD? And what have you already found?
Yeah, it's a great question. The numbers are daunting, but what keeps me optimistic is that when parents and teachers work together, they get a whole lot more done than when they work independently. And it's actually pretty stark, the difference. So I'll share a little bit more about the outcomes we've been seeing in schools that often struggle to get 20% of parents to show up for a report card conference. Our weekly family workshops average 88% attendance, despite all the challenges of the digital divide and kind of the moment that we're in. For every hour that a teacher leads a family workshop, parents then deliver 25 hours of tutoring at home. And that creates this enormous leverage on an educator's time at such a critical moment when teacher capacity is massively constrained. The result of that is that kids accelerate their learning. During each, we do short 5 or 10 week goal setting cycles between families and educators. Even though the cycles are short, kids still average a 3 to 4 month reading gain during each 5 or 10 week cycle, closing the gap to grade level performance by about half in a relatively short period of time. We recently did an external evaluation that found that the kids that were furthest behind grade level are the ones that made the largest gains, which is especially heartening given the way that COVID has disproportionately impacted marginalized populations. We were able to do a study where we looked at iReady Lexile scores from before the first shutdown and the next fall for both a group of program participants where families and educators were working arm in arm, and then also for a control group in those same set of schools where families and educators were each kind of left to their own devices. And we found that participants averaged a 261-point gain relative to a control group that grew just 41 points. So the fact that in the very same school communities, the very same profile of student, family, and educator, when parents and teachers were working together, they made 6 times, kids made 6 times as much progress as a control group. It's a testament to the power of family-educator collaboration. So we're concerned, but optimistic that when families and educators partner up, that they can turn the COVID slide into a springboard.
That is remarkable. Are you thinking, I mean, obviously LAUSD is like a very big, opportunity for you all, so there's a big scale experiment there. Are you thinking about other ways in which you can innovate scale? And is tech a part of that?
Yeah, tech is definitely a part of that. I think about innovation in 2 ways. There's sustaining innovation, kind of the incremental improvements that you do to the work that you're already doing so that you can reach greater scale, greater operational consistency, you can drive down cost, and so that is very much the focus of our organization, as we've set a target to grow from impacting 20,000 kids to 200,000 kids annually over the course of the next decade, and sustaining innovation is the name of the game. We have to drive down cost and also increase simplicity so that we can continue to support a larger and larger number of school districts in a bigger way. Technology is a critical way to realize those cost savings and still provide support to educators and families so that they can kind of participate in our programming. That is different than disruptive innovation, which is more of a break from the precedent. And there we're tackling a different set of questions, still facilitated by technology, but to me, tech is just kind of it's a vehicle, it's a way to amplify human intent, but it isn't like the goal in and of itself. So when I think about disruptive innovation as opposed to just kind of growing our programmatic footprint to its natural limit, it's a fundamentally different set of questions that we're asking, and related actually to data transparency of all things. So when I think about the future, when I look in the crystal ball, I envision an education system in which families and educators work together rather than in isolation to accelerate student learning. And I want that to be standard practice, the norm, rather than the exception. And in order for that to happen, you need to have a groundswell of families and educators that are demanding change. But one of the biggest impasses to that is perhaps not the one you'd expect. It's data transparency. According to research from Learning Heroes, and I see Bib here in the room, according to research from Learning Heroes, 9 in 10 parents think their kid is performing on grade level, when in reality we know that only 1 in 3 kids actually are reading on grade level. Marginalized parents in particular are in the dark. If you don't even realize that your kid is falling further and further behind, then how can you possibly advocate as vociferously as you'd like to on behalf of your child? There also isn't a great incentive system for school systems to share that information directly with families. Like, show me the principal that's gonna call every family in the building and say,
we're doing
hey,
poorly.
by the way, I know your kid's been getting A's and B's, but I thought I ought to tell you that they're actually 2 years behind grade level. I'm sorry. That conversation is not going to happen. So the bet that we're making is that if we put assessment directly in the hands of families, give parents a direct line of sight into their children's reading development, that we can unleash just a groundswell of parent activism that's been kind of trapped under this data visibility issue. And our hope in building this parent-facing literacy screener, PFLS, PIFLs, if you will, is that'll kind of flip the power dynamic in school systems. Districts serving high-income families demonstrate a lot of accountability. They feel primarily accountable to those parents. Districts serving marginalized families demonstrate very little accountability to those families, at least in part because those parents are kept in the dark. If we can turn the lights on, then we can make parents, we can enable them to be more savvy and demanding consumers of their children's education, and that in turn can make schools more equitable places that value parents as assets, that invest in them as partners, and that are accountable to families regardless of race or income.
Yeah, this issue of transparency for equity is one that just doesn't get nearly enough attention. Thank you. I mean, for that remarkable set of comments, Michelle. I think you want to get in for a second, but just questions. We are open to questions from the floor, so please think of those and raise your hand, and we'll figure it out. And secondly, each of these organizations represented here are nonprofits. So for you investors out there, just saying, this is a remarkable group of panelists, so you should check them out further. Michelle.
I actually just wanted to jump on board with and to say, Alejandro, that one of the things that I think that's really interesting about what you're sharing is also the amazing opportunity there is there for families of children who have special needs in particular. And I'm compelled that partly because I am a special needs parent, and I think about the data transparency piece that is so critical to being able to provide the educational equity. And if you don't know, then how can you advocate? How can you even ask the right questions? So kudos, I think it's amazing.
Yeah. Any questions from the field? Yeah, go ahead. I'll repeat it if people can hear.
So
Who are you?
My name is Matthew Gross. I work with the Diocese of San Diego. We have 34 preschools. And one of our big problem statements right now is how do we raise the profession of being an early childhood educator to that of at least being like a teacher? Because right now we're seeing the disparity between those two professions. And so I don't know if anyone on the stage has
I'll give it to Michelle to start out. Thank you for that question. Did everybody hear it? It was all about raising the sort of recognition of the early childhood, profession to be appropriate given their outsized role in building our future.
Yes, well, first, thank you for saying that and stating it, because that is what we all need to state and say. And then we need our systems to step up to be able to appropriately support our educators in the same way that we are valuing education for K through 12 teachers. I mean, our early education teachers are not on compensation parity. They don't get the support. So I think it's a couple different places. One is continuing at the state and local levels to state and share the data of what we know in terms of the critical aspect of the work that people are doing, to be able to recognize that they need the same level of supports as an educator that teaches 8th grade and 10th grade, that early educators need the same level of supports. Ece has been working with national organizations across the country on something called Power to the Profession, where we laid out a professional standards framework and recognizing, much like in nursing and in other professions, the recognition that you can enter this profession and be recognized at different levels levels, starting from a CDA, the Child Development Associate, the associates to the bachelor's degree, and having the ability to be able to move through the profession and be recognized in a competency structure. So we are going to be working on that. We have model legislation, so stay tuned. You can go to our website and learn more about that, but it is an effort that was undertaken with Ece being part of the conversation, but now is going to continue to be led forward, and we love your voice and involvement.
Other questions? Go ahead and just state your name.
Hi, my name's Maddie. This is a question for Alejandro, but I'd also be happy to hear from anyone else. When you're talking about parent engagement, guardian and family engagement, what a critical time to talk about this when we're also facing parental rights conversations. And I'd love to hear your perspectives on why it's important to connect with parents and guardians early.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I think you're right that family engagement is having a moment, a long overdue moment. And it's tricky in that it's, without getting too political, like family engagement is also being weaponized in some ways as like there's an opportunity to kind of mobilize, tap into the energy that parents have, like that parents love for their kids. Like it's this boundless energy, and folks are starting to realize that, we can like channel that energy toward any number of things. So while I'm heartened by the conversation and the greater visibility around families, I'm concerned about how folks are seeking to leverage that incredibly powerful force and that kind of bottomless well. And what I'd like to see more of is channeling that energy toward children's learning and well-being. I'm seeing the family engagement conversation happen over here, the COVID learning recovery conversation happen over there, when in reality, like family engagement is the pathway to COVID learning recovery, right? Families are the tutors that are hiding in plain sight. They've already been putting the work in, and yet the sector hasn't invested in families with the tools and resources to make that sustainable over the long run, and to ensure that families are kind of getting the most from the effort that they're putting in. So that, I think, is the opportunity to kind of demystify what does it look like for families and educators to work together. We've learned a lot about that over the last decade. I'm happy to continue the dialogue with anyone about how to make that happen in a simple and sustainable way by building a relationship at the outset, measuring a baseline, setting a goal, doing a lot of practice together, measuring progress relative to the goal, and then celebrating together. It really can be that simple, but the transformative impact that has, accelerating children's learning trajectories, is super powerful.
Thanks for the question, Maddie, and thank you, Alejandro.
That just really quickly. I just wanted to add in, because first of all, the work you're doing is amazing, but I also think taking this, especially for younger kids, and looking both at the formal learning context and how you bring parents there, but also the informal learning that happens through media and everything else that children have access to, right? Parents are not getting good feedback on that either, and we know that children do learn. This is obviously Sesame's sweet spot, right? Through all these interactions with media. So the more we can feed them back really a more holistic view of how are their kids learning, where are they sort of in this mapping, and what are the whole range of things that are really impacting their learning, I think will really be helpful for them. I think it will empower parents to feel like, especially in places where schools are not necessarily, when they don't have Alejandro's program, right? How do we get to those parents too, right, and really help them? I think that's a critical piece too.
Great. We just have a couple minutes left, and so I'm going to do a little experiment that may crash and burn. This will be called the Ece Lightning Round. So each of you have 1 minute, please, to point out the one major priority, what I would call must do, and the one maybe worry, anxiety you have, watch out, when we're thinking about the issues that relate to the future of the early childhood ecosystem. I will begin with Allie.
So a must do and a watch out. I'd say must do, again, I would go to data and assessment and the transparency. I think that's super critical, and we have to address that, and again, across formal and informal learning context. The flip side of that, and this is the sort of watch out for that, is, I have been on the development side of a lot of dashboards. and they don't work, right, for the most part. So we need to think about ways that are much more user-friendly, that are really intuitive for parents. So that's the big watch out, because I have seen a lot of not great work in that space.
Okay, Alejandro.
Must do, watch out, a minute on the clock. So the must do, I've like been a cheerleader for family engagement, but I want to make it much more actionable. So at Springboard, we distilled from our programs kind of a method we call Family Educator Learning Accelerators, FELA for short. They're 5 to 10 week cycles during which parents and teachers team up to help kids reach learning goals. And anyone in the room who works with kids can use it. Step 1, building relational trust, whether it's an in-person home visit like the old days or a virtual team building huddle. You don't get far without trust. Step 2, measure that baseline because of data transparency and everything we talked about. Step 3, set a growth goal, and that goal has to be winnable in 5 to 10 weeks. Fewer than 5 weeks doesn't produce a habit. Longer than 10 weeks and the finish line's too far away to feel motivating. Step 4, practice, practice, practice. Kids practice with their educators, with their families at home, and the whole team has to get together at least 4 times to share skills and create mutual accountability. Then you measure progress and you celebrate. That's what crystallizes the lasting habits, so that even 6 months after a learning accelerator is over, parents are still supporting their kids with reading every bit as much, every bit as often. So that's like the actionable thing. The watch out is that I'm seeing many school systems reach for the familiar set of classroom interventions that have only ever failed to move the needle. So this is really a moment to make the bold bets required to rebuild a school system in which families and educators can work together as a matter of course.
Amazing. Michelle, can you top that out? Top that? Bring us home.
No, but what I'll try to, I know that we are at time, but I'll say the must do is we cannot go back to the way it was. We cannot go back. We have to agree that we are not going to go back to how it has been. So that's the must do. The watch out is we can't overcomplicate it. We have to keep it centered on the child. If we keep it centered on the child, we will make it work for the teachers, for the educators, for the parents, for the schools, for the extended caregivers and the network. We will be able to make it work. So center on the child.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Ali. I think we can say that was an incredible conversation. Thank you all.